צהריים טובים, הסשן הזה יתנהל באנגלית. This will be done in English, so whoever needs any translation. The session is about anti-Semitism and its impact on the Jewish people and perhaps the security of Israel. The way it will be conducted is each one of the speakers, including myself, will give about 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes presentation. Then we'll conduct a conversation with questions between us, and then I'll turn it to questions from the audience. One rule, if you want to have a question, you can't get up. You have to raise your hand, and the lady here on your right side will come and take a note from you. I will only answer questions that come as notes, no verbal questions, so you have to write it down. So here we go. The subject of anti-Semitism is anti-Semitism. I'd like to introduce, first of all, Dr. Charles Small is the founder and director of the Institute of the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, and he will give some review about the status of anti-Semitism today. Charles, please.
So thank you. So I'm really honored to be here. Yossie, thank you for inviting me, and I'm honored to be with distinguished members of the panel. I'm also, from my perspective, particularly honored to be here at the IDC. And I think what we're trying to do at ISGAP works well in this context. We find at ISGAP that people studying anti-Semitism know the history of anti-Semitism and the power of anti-Semitism. But those of us who study anti-Semitism know very little about the Middle East, about Islamic culture, the processes, the divisions in society in this region. And yet, on the other hand, those who are dealing with strategic issues and know the region well and understand the culture and the changing dynamics, we find in the world of anti-Semitism studies that not enough attention is being placed on the power of the ideology of anti-Semitism and how anti-Semitism is a strategic threat, not just to the Jewish people or to Israel, but to Western democratic values. Yossie asked me to speak about the situation in the United States. Very quickly, the FBI in 2016 saw an increase in anti-Semitic incidences. The majority of religious-motivated crimes in the United States the Jews are the greatest target. The majority of attacks, of religious bias attacks, happen against the Jewish community in the United States. The New York City Police, for example, has seen a dramatic rise in anti-Semitic acts in the New York greater region. During the first 2 months of this year, of 2017, attacks against Jewish people in the United States rose 94% compared to the year before. So these statistics are alarming, and I can go on in great detail, but they're important to understand that there's a changing dynamic, not just in Europe, but also in the United States. The ADL survey, it's available online. I would urge you to look at it. They also document similar statistics of an increase of anti-Semitism. And I would just also like to say, just as a short story, Professor Larry Amsel, who's a member of our team at ISGAP, he's a professor of psychiatry at Columbia University, and he's starting to do a survey on the consciousness of American Jews to the security threat around them. And it's interesting, he observed as a New Yorker that when people come to New York, when businesses open in New York or institutions open in New York, that's the place to be. It's a sign of success and achievement. And yet Jewish organizations and Jewish institutions in the city of New York intentionally downplay their visibility for security issues. And yet when you do a survey of most American Jews or New York Jews, many would scoff at you to think that there's anti-Semitism. In our office, we're headquartered in New York City, and I can assure you that our security, our day-to-day security in our office has increased substantially. We have a small office in the AJC building, and the security protocol has changed drastically over the years. This brings us, in a sense, to the university, what's happening on campus. The Amcha Institute, run by Tammy Benjamin, has done work measuring anti-Semitism on university campuses and looking at the impact that anti-Semitism has on students in American universities. And she discovered through her studies that over 100 institutions in the United States have reported anti-Semitic acts, anti-Semitic incidents on university campuses, and they're up from 287 in 2016 to only 198 the previous year. So she's seeing a 45% increase in anti-Semitic attacks at American universities. There's an important study done by Barry Cosman from Hartford, from the Trinity College in Hartford, and he did a survey that 56% of American Jewish students in a 6-month period have experienced anti-Semitism. Women who experience sexist incidences or African Americans who experience racism only experience about 18 to 20%. So Jewish students in the United States are experiencing a more dramatic effect of anti-Semitism. And what we've noticed in our study, there's a serious gap between the experiences of older Americans compared to younger Americans. More anti-Semitism is affecting the younger generations than the older generations. And in a sense, the university is the gateway for the anti-Semitism to arise, that is arriving in the United States. I'll also be brief. There's anti-Semitism on the internet is becoming an issue, particularly in the United States. Thanks to the First Amendment, the United States is actually the home of many of the websites and the URLs of anti-Semitic and radical messaging. I just want to find my statistics, sorry. Yes, so the United States has the most instances of anti-Semitism in social media. In the United States, 68% of global anti-Semitism is happening from American URLs. More than 382,000 anti-Semitic posts on social media platforms from the United States were posted in 2016. That's 43.6 posts per hour, or about 1 for 83 seconds. According to the Pew Research Center, 62% of Americans who receive news through the media, and they are experiencing anti-Semitism. The data shows that 29 million surfers were exposed to anti-Semitism in 2016. So this is becoming an important issue. At ISGAP, we're also looking at funding of American universities, and this is an issue that I think requires significant attention. A concerted effort has been made from the Gulf states to put money into the United States, particularly universities, and this is becoming well documented. There's good work at the IDC and at other institutions doing this. In our work, we've also discovered domestic funding, major corporations funding American universities with an agenda that is pro-Islamist, and they are affecting the United States, funding American university to the tune of many billions of dollars, funding institutions, chairing and chairs of professorships, and changing the culture of universities. And I would argue that if we want to stop the BDS movement, the demonization of Israel, and not just Israel, but Jewish peoplehood, because diaspora Jews are also, in a sense, feeling the brunt of the attack and the demonization of Israel. Because if Israel is an apartheid, racist, Nazi state, and I'll get to this image in a moment, then Jews in the diaspora communities who have a strong affinity to Israel, to the problematic entity, they also become problematic and are targeted by the left-wing intellectual media and intellectual circles in the universities, and also, as we see, by radical Muslim populations in urban centers in Europe and also increasingly in the United States. So if we want to cut off the head of the snake, I would argue that we have to understand our enemy. We have to understand how, for generations, funding has affected American education, and intellectually, the Edward Said, the postmodernity that demonizes Israel in mainstream education, in mainstream curriculum at the finest universities in the United States of America, that teach young Jewish students to hate who they are as a people and distance themselves from their attachment and affinity to Israel, the Jewish homeland, and that this is mainstream education and causing all sorts of problems, including assimilation and the increased alienation from Zionism, and even famous pollsters in the United States saying that we should not, as a community, mention Zionism because it doesn't work anymore in the popular culture. And that's because for 2 generations, the head of the snake, the people who teach journalists, the people who teach policymakers, these are the people informing the next generation of leaders. So if we do retractions in the New York Times or in the media, it really doesn't matter anymore because the journalists at the finest universities have been inculcated in this sort of postmodern, post-colonial, politically correct ideology. And it's gotten to the point in popular culture. I have 1 minute. I'll just say in popular culture. We have this gentleman who is a very good musician named Roger Waters. He's the head of the cultural boycott, the main figure in the cultural boycott against Israel, in the BDS movement. During his performances, he dresses up as a Nazi. He reenacts some sort of childhood trauma he had with his father. The stage is draped in Nazi-like flags. There's a pig floating in the sky with a Magen David on it. And he reenacts this image. That's bad enough. But when he gets off stage, in keeping in this image of ideology, when he gets off stage, he's calling for a boycott, like that image would instruct us he would naturally do, but he calls for a boycott against Israel. And given the political culture and progressive moment we live in, not only does he get away with it, he's making a fortune. He's the greatest solo artist grossing tour in the history of music. So he's very popular, and he's having an impact on popular culture and infusing the BDS into popular culture. And I would just say that the Jewish community and the human rights community should not stand for this, that there is a direct correlation between anti-Semitism and the BDS. And this is what we have done and many scholars have done through our research. And I would just leave you with one question. Could you imagine in my art, I put on a white sheet and I burnt a cross. And that was part of my art as a white man putting on a white sheet, burning a cross. And when I get off stage, I call for the re-enslavement of African Americans. Could you imagine if a Muslim crescent was on a pig floating in my concerts and I said we should boycott all Muslims? And yet our community in the United States and in the diaspora accepts this as art and beyond our criticism. And we should, in the keeping of the boycott movement, ensure that Roger Waters and other performers who stopped or tried to alienate Israel, the only democracy in this part of the world, that we get major corporations to divest from his concert tour, as American Express recently did. So this is, in my view, an opportunity to take a stand in the United States of America and fight contemporary anti-Semitism in our midst. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Mr. Rafael Bardají is Executive Director of the Friends of Israel Initiative and is a former National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of Spain. I think he can give a different perspective from Europe, and but not only, about the situation. So please, Mr. Bardají.
I'll speak as a non-Jewish and as a European-based person. So I think I could add some color to the audience given my characteristics. The panel title is The New Anti-Semitism, and I have to agree that there is a new anti-Semitism, totally different from the old one or the traditional one that came from the right, the Nazi, the Catholic Church. There is something else that we have not paid much attention, actually. And I think the roots of this new anti-Semitism, I can place them in the early 70s, and not on the right or in the Catholic Church, but on the European left forces and parties. The European left, after the 73 war, the Yom Kippur War, realized that against the willingness of the Israeli to die for the country, they were, in Europe, extreme pacifists. As a defense minister of the time said, I better die than kill. So instead of understanding why the Israelis were fighting for their survival, we retreat into an extreme pacifism that make totally unconnected to the reality of the Middle East and Israel. The second argument was that while the Israelis were proud of being Israelis and have a state here, we were moving into a global, multinational, multicultural world where the Europeans, if any, had only guilt and complexes. So the left couldn't understand and accept the national pride of the Israelis. And finally, I think there was the extreme and fast secularization experimented in Europe thanks to the left that really crashed like a train crash with the religion identity of the Jewish people. I think those three elements made a very explosive cocktail that only now are really erupting in full force. Because after those years, the 70s, 80s, the left, the anti-Americanism, anti-Israelis, they were telling everyone that they were not anti-Semitic, that they were just criticizing Israeli policies. False, lies, self-deception. They blurred the line between anti-Semitism and the logic criticism of any government as the Israeli ones. They were putting the seeds of the new form of anti-Semitism today in Europe, which is the prevalent force. Why? Because they stand that it was much more important not to believe in anything than to believe in something like here, that it was more important to accept everyone else above our own beliefs and values, and that the people should be open to receive anyone from the world into Europe because the European culture, the European civilization was almost nothing to defend. And unfortunately, it was latent in the 90s because of the crumble of the Soviet Union and the communist ideas and everything, but has made a resurgence now in the last 2 or 3 years in a very forceful way. Why? Because Angela Merkel, Germany's chancellor, said in September 2015 that Germany, which meaning Europe, will be open door to anyone in the world that could come as a refugee or even as an economic migrant. As you know better than me, more than 1 million people came to Germany between September 2015 and June, September 16. Another million probably is wandering around different countries from Greece to Italy and Spain, Portugal, and France. And this is a migration that we never had experienced since the Second World War. Actually, never experienced in the way that Middle Eastern people came in such a big wave into Europe. Why does it affecting anti-Semitism? Because basically they come from Islamic countries. They have been, the young people, 70% of them are young male people exposed to radical ideas. Our intelligence are tracking many elements beyond the ability of any intelligence service, that not because they have connections already with terrorist groups, but because they have been seeing people in mosques, imams, and others that we know they have been nurturing this hatred culture and the radicalization of the young people in Syria, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Algeria, Libya, Morocco, and other countries. So that's a growing problem, which means it's more Islam in Europe means automatically more anti-Semitism in Europe. That's a fact. You can discard whatever you want, but this is the reality, and we know it. The problem is that the establishment, the political establishment in Europe, is blind to this fact. They are still arguing for an open-door policy, which is creating more and more social friction and more problems for everyone, including the Jewish communities. When you have to stop going to the synagogue in France because you feel threatened, it's a problem. But it's a problem that nobody wants to report in the media, nobody in the leadership in Europe or the European Union want to recognize. Nobody wants to recognize that Stockholm today is the capital with the highest rape rate in the world, even more than Lesotho. In the year 2012, there were 400 criminal cases for rape in Sweden. Last year, more than 6,000, and most of them because of gang rapes by Muslim young people that are moving to Sweden. Though nobody wants to report, say, foreigners, nobody wants to ask what religion they were, and this is totally a suicidal mode. Fortunately, there have been some reactions. Unfortunately for many, probably here in Israel, the reaction has come from the so-called alt-right. But I have to say that a couple of years ago, we put a program from Friends of Israel Initiative to reach out to the leadership of those parties and engage in a conversation with them. And my personal experience is that despite what is portrayed in the media as almost Nazi forces, extreme far right, far from them. That's not the reality I found in the Alliance for Germany, the PVV of Geert Wilders in Deutschland, in Holland, or even the National Front in France with the direction of Marine Le Pen. So I know that Israelis have tend to disdain engaging with this right because of historical reasons, but I think it's a mistake. And the sooner the Israelis start talking to them, the more chances we can have for shaping the ideas about the future relation between Europe and Israel. Because one only issue, they are the only forces which are anti-Islamist in Europe nowadays. And there's the only hope in there to fight the current and prevalent Islamization of Europe. You find them exaggerating. Look at the leader of the Labour Party in the UK, Corbyn, a declared friend of Hamas. Look at Podemos in Spain, 20% of the vote, with a TV station paid declared by Iran. Look at whatever you want. I mean, the money is flowing from Saudi Arabia, Iran, other countries, and they are nurturing a new generation of Muslims which are not only enraged, but also much more assertive and expanding a cultural jihad in Europe. So my last point, despite the failures in electoral system by the alt-right in many countries, I think it may sound extravagant, but I have to say it. The only success in Europe today for fighting and battling the establishment and the Muslim and the jihad is for the American president to succeed. Is the only person that has been able to open up a minimum window of opportunity to discuss the future of Islam in Europe. And if he fails, the establishment in Europe will send all the alt-right and anti-Islamist forces in Europe to the margin of history. And that will be the real problem for us, Europeans, which are not agree with Islam, and for you, Israelis, because you will have a continent that will sacrifice you in order to appease the Muslim. Thank you.
One of the questions we have is actually what's going on? Why is it all happening? And I think people talk about Muslim, but we have to understand a little bit deeper. Unfortunately, we grew up in Israel with the concept that anti-Semitism is Christian. This is what we learned in school for 2,000 years, how it grew up, how it came to be, and of course culminating in the Holocaust. But the new anti-Semitism is very different, and I think we may want to look at that in that way. So the definition is very simple. We, the Jews, are, and I think every word is important, we're intended collateral damage of a worldwide Islamist expansion. And I'll explain that in the presentation very quickly. First of all, what's an Islamist? There's 1.7 billion Muslims in the world. We're only talking about 200, 300 million of them. It's not the religion as a whole, it's movement within the religions. Those are the Islamists. They're currently represented by 3 countries, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Qatar, each one supporting a different faction of the Islamist movement. All the rest of the movement are some outgrowth from these 3 countries, and most important, they are outgrowth from the dollars of these countries. Because for the first time, we have a movement here, an anti-Semitic movement, that is state-sponsored at least since the Holocaust. So what are the Islamists want? They actually are not interested in the Jews at all. What they want is to radicalize and unify the Arab and Muslim world under the Islamist ideology. They want a Middle East free of Christian, Jews, and all others. They want a Muslim Europe, and they want world domination at some future horizon. Let's talk a little bit about that because that's important. So radicalizing the Muslim world is where we see a lot of the activities. When you see a madrasa in Pakistan, that's not because of Jews. When they build a mosque in Minnesota to radicalize all the Somalis that came from Somalia to the US, that's not because of Jews. It's only to radicalize more and more Muslims. When Saudi Arabia funds a mosque in the northern part of Israel, it is to radicalize the Muslims in Israel. It's everywhere, including in our own country. Muslim expansion. If you look at the Middle East, the number of Christians in the Middle East, it's the lowest it's been in generations. And certainly as a percentage of the population. There's only one country in the whole Middle East where the Christian population grew in the last 20 years, and that's Israel. In certain places, Christian population that existed for almost 2,000 years have disappeared and are disappearing everywhere. So we are not an exception. We're just another of the others that live in this area that they want to get rid of. Of course, they want to complete what they consider an incomplete mission, and that is making Europe Muslim. And as far as they're looking at it right now, they're moving rightly on, and they're succeeding. I'm not sure they will in the future. I think Europe will wake up in a violent way, very violent way, historically, but I think that we can see right now that this is still very much their focus, and they spend a lot of dollars on it. And of course, they want to continue the rest of the world expansion and pushing the West and the West ideas everywhere. So we are part of the West, America is part of the West, they're pushing it all. So you ask yourself, where is this in the Jews? And why are we there? So here is the crucial point. Mr. Bardají mentioned the 70s, it started in the 60s. 1968, there was a conference in Al-Azhar University in Cairo where all the Muslim radical ideologues were there. All the people that the intelligence services found later on in all kinds of organizations everywhere, and ideologues in Saudi Arabia, in Iran, etc. Iran not so much, but more like Qatar and others, but Al-Qaeda, etc. They were all there. And they had two very critical decisions. One, to use anti-Semitism, and by the way, all the protocols are available in English. You can get this book on Amazon. This is the modern world. So, they decided that anti-Semitism was a wonderful tool that will allow them to penetrate the world because of hidden anti-Semitic feeling, especially in the left and the right in Europe, which was always very anti-Semitic. And they use it very effectively, as we can see now historically. The second thing is they changed Islamic law. Traditional Islamic law, where the Jews are the people of the book, and if they pay their tax, the ruler has the obligation to protect them. That is no longer the case. They said, no, Jews are eternal enemies of Islam and must be obliterated. So, today, when they open a mosque in Minneapolis or anywhere in the United States or anywhere in Europe to radicalize the Muslim, part of the curriculum is this. This is not the purpose of the curriculum, but it's part of the curriculum. So you have a generation of immigrants to Europe that their parents didn't hate Jews, didn't think too much about it. They lived with Jews before. Their children are educated as pure anti-Semitic on a religious basis. So let's talk a little bit about how it works. Some of the activities. I'm not going to cover all of them because I don't have a lot of time, but just an example. So they're trying to control the media world. They control all Muslim media. They bought it all. All Arabic media was bought by Saudi Arabia and Qatar, 100% ownership. They established all kinds of monitoring and control areas. They expanded it to the United States. And it goes in many ways, not always direct. For example, sometimes they're buying, but sometimes they're buying the coverage. If you've ever been to Europe and open CNN International, all the advertising is Arabic, is from the Gulf state. CNN, based on testimonies directly, would not have an existence, economic existence, without those advertising. So that controls, of course, what's going on. And they're also suing media outlets. So when they sue the New York Times and the Post, they always lose on First Amendment. But after 2-3 lawsuits where they spend millions of dollars, they now apply self-censorship. So we try to publish research on some Saudi activist that was even testified about in Congress, and not a single American media outlet was ready to publish it. They're buying everywhere in Europe the financial power. Just to give you an example, they buy strategically. They are the largest shareholder of every car manufacturer in Europe. Why? Because those are the consumers of oil. Everything is strategic. It is not coincidental. I'll skip some of this. Influencing higher education. They do it in many ways, but most people don't understand. The big number is in the students. Just Saudi Arabia itself has 100,000 students in the world, 65,000 in the United States. That's a subsidy of $5 billion to American university, and those who would donate it to university know this is unrestricted. It's worth like $10 billion. So when the chancellor of UCLA has some anti-Semitic incidents, but he has 1,000 Saudi students, he's thinking about the 100 million he's getting every year, not about the anti-Semitic incidents. And they're using all kinds of tools there. I don't have enough time to describe all of them. Of course, BDS is also anti-Semitism, and I'll just quote Martin Luther King, who said, "You can't be against Zionism. If you're against Zionism, you're anti-Semitic." So the point is, we're fighting a very dangerous foe that is not doing anything about us. It's about their advancing their interest, and we're the collateral damage, and they spend tens or hundreds of billions a year on this process. Thank you. Sima Vaknin is the Vaknin-Gil, the Director General of the Minister of Strategic Affairs. Thank you.
The first decision I had to make this day is whether to stay seated and see only the front row, or stay for 10 minutes on my high heels and see everybody. And I chose to see everybody because I would like you to understand exactly what is it that we are doing in the Ministry of Strategic Affairs. And I think by seeing everybody, it probably will be helpful for me to convey the message, which in 10 minutes time, it's very hard to convey. When Yossie told me you had only 10 minutes, I asked myself, how would I squeeze 18 months of hard work, intensive work in the Ministry of Strategic Affairs of about 20 people working together to create the strategy of the Jewish state against this new challenge that we are facing? And one might ask himself, how come BDS is on the same line with anti-Semitism in this panel? So I have to say that we are not working on BDS, because BDS is just one symptom of a greater phenomena. And this phenomena is the delegitimization of the Israeli state as the homeland of the Jewish people. And when you look at this, with your permission, I won't use the delegitimization again because it's a very hard word for the Israelis to say. But the hate campaign which we are facing here in Israel is something which has far deeper root than one might think. When I talk to people, some people tell me it's all about making the Israeli government do the correct choices. Well, it's not. It's got heavier roots, and it's got a lot to do with anti-Semitism. It's not the same phenomena. The hate campaign or the BDS is not anti-Semitism, not the most classical one, but it has the same scent, it has the same notion, it has the same roots, and sometimes it has the same outcome. And once you understand that, you have to understand that what Yossie has finished with is what Israeli government has decided 18 months ago. We cannot sit aside and let the pro-Israeli network do the job for us. So I asked myself, how would I convey the message of what we have been doing in the ministry for the last 18 months in less than 10 minutes? So I chose to do what I used to do in the Israeli Air Force, when the Israeli Air Force Director General told me after a whole year of work on a special doctrine on targeting, Sima, you have 10 minutes, shoot. So what I will do is I will talk in points. I will talk just in bottom lines, and if something is of interest to you, then ask me later what I meant. 17 points. The first one, it will be divided into 17 points, will be divided just like in Chad Gadya, to 1, 2, 3, 5, and 7. 1 vision, 2 guidelines, 3 goals, 5 key components of a doctrine, and 7 key principles, if I may say so. The vision is very simple. The vision says that Israel's right to exist as the homeland of the Jewish people is no longer questioned. The sheer fact that we have to say that as a vision is something of the extraordinary, because no other country in the world, or let's say most of the countries in the world, especially the democracies among them and the Western countries, don't have to ask themselves whether they should work to gain their right to live. But our right to existence and our right to defend ourselves is being questioned all over. So the vision is very, very simple. The 2 guidelines. We have come to this game far too late, the Israeli government, I have to say. We woke up 10 years late. But there were a lot of people working on this issue before us. But the efforts were scattered. There were scattered efforts, and what we are trying to do is take all these efforts and move them in the direction of a diffused campaign. Now, if I were speaking in Hebrew, the word I would use would be ma'aracha. Those of you coming from the IDF would understand what ma'aracha means. In English, we don't have a good word, so we use the word campaign. So in order for you to understand what is it that we are doing, which is different from a normal campaign that you might see on the media, I would like to tell you that this is an holistic view of the whole phenomena. Understanding the opponent, understanding the people we are working against, looking for the vulnerabilities, understanding the way to attack, if you want to attack, to change their minds and hearts, if you want to change the mind and hearts, prevent, if you want to prevent. So you have to develop a set of tools. You have to know what your advantages are. You have to use your own advantages in order to bring them to your comfort zone, take them out of their comfort zone. And when you do that in a holistic way, utilizing all the pro-Israeli network together to the same direction, this is a campaign. And this is something which was not done until the Ministry of Strategic Affairs was created. But there was a lot of effort, wonderful effort. Adam represents a wonderful initiative that took place in the United States. Those initiatives were managing to contain the phenomena, not to win. We are here to win. The second guideline, very shortly, we are not fighting with facts. We are not fighting by telling the truth. Because we are fighting on hearts and minds, we should make sure that those people who create the image of reality from what they know will create the correct image. We are in a time of post-truth, shallow discourse, things that are launched to the net and elsewhere with no checks, and we have to make sure that the image of Israel is changed. 3 goals, very shortly. First of all, we should prevent the other side from winning any kind of battle. And sorry again for using a military language, but inside a campaign you have many battles. If you win too many battles or enough battles, you will change the whole campaign, the whole trend of the campaign. So the fact is that we are preventing the other side, the opponent, and I'm not talking about the average European deciding not to buy something from Judah and Samaria because he thinks he's doing wonderful. No, I'm not talking about those people. I'm talking about the generators. And those generators, we are putting them on the defensive, and we're doing that by preventing them any kind of success. The other thing is we want to delegitimize the sheer phenomena of delegitimization of a country. We don't want this phenomena to be shared by too many. And this last thing is that we understand that people are ignorant of what is happening here in Israel. Of course, we give them sometimes some of the details to make sure that they will keep on thinking bad things about Israel. But on a whole, they are ignorant about us. So we want to make sure that the reality, the complex reality of Israel, will be transformed to those people. 5 key components of the operational doctrine that was developed in the MSA. First of all, without too much information to you guys, too much intelligence is needed in order to win a battle. So we put a lot of effort on intelligence. In the Israeli Air Force, we always talked about aerial superiority. In the MSA, we are talking about intelligence superiority or information superiority. We will never take an action, we will never go on an operation activity without having enough intelligence. By the way, the key component, we call them E4I. You have C4I for command and control. You have E4I in the MSA for the key component of the operational activity. First, intelligence. Second, 3 types of engagement. Engagement in the social media, engagement on their own turf, and engagement here in Israel. So once we are on the virtual world, second time we are on the real world, on their turf, and third time we are bringing people here to Israel to make sure that they will see with their own eyes what is happening here. And the last thing, the last E for I, is extraction. We have wonderful people in the MSA, but all of us are between the age of 52, me, and downwards to 28. Extraction of good capabilities, ideas, initiative, and so on are not coming for people our age. I've got a wonderful, a brilliant young man under me, the Director General of the whole campaign. You will meet him later in the next panel. But I won't say your age, don't be afraid, Tzachi. But anyway, we need people of the age of 20, of the age of 18 sometimes are bringing the best ideas. So extraction of those ideas from the pro-Israeli network and enhancing them is the thing that we want to do. 5 key components and 7 principles. Bottom lines. From defense to offense, I think you understand the idea. Taking use of the advantages of the Israeli government, Israel as a state, the fact that we are a cyber nation, and so on and so forth. Combination of tools using the advantages that we have and the other side don't. Filling in the gaps. When you look at the whole campaign, the way the ministry looks, you see a lot of gaps. A lot of money is poured into USA. None of the money goes to Europe, South Africa, and South America. Someone has to work there. A lot of the money goes to campuses, none to faculty. A lot of the money goes to culture, none goes to CSR, corporate social responsibility. Someone has to work there, and that's what we are doing. We are working in multi-dimensions without much going into deeper the things that we do, but we work open and covert, direct and indirect, initiative and preventive, negative and positive. Let your imagination run. We work under the no logo strategy. None of the things that we have done, you've seen the MSA written all over it. And we have done a lot. By the way, until now, we have proof of concept to several key components of the doctrine, and I don't think you ever saw Minister Gilad Erdan or the people from the ministry written as those who initiated this activity. The Big Tent, Reut Institute, they came up with this term, Big Tent. We took it in, and we work with everybody who's willing to work with us, unless they don't believe in the Israeli state. And the last thing, network versus network. Obviously, there is a loose network. We want to make it a tighter network. 3 things you have to put into a network in order for it to work as a network. Budget. We pour a lot of money into the network, the pro-Israeli network. Strategy. We have shown our strategy to everybody. And, of course, information. I told you before, information superiority. Hopefully, I just raised your imagination as to what we are doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sima. Next, Mr. Adam Milstein, National Chairman of the Israeli-American Council. Adam.
I'm sorry, I guess technical difficulties here. I know, but that's not what I wanted to show. It's just running, and I'd like to actually control it if it's possible. But let me start in the meantime. Thank you, Yossie, for the introduction. I am the chairman of the Israeli-American Council in the United States, the fastest growing Jewish organization in the United States, with operation activities nationwide in about 27 states. I want to acknowledge Dr. Miriam and Sheldon Edelson, who are honoring us here in their presence. They are very big donors to the IDC. They are huge donors to the Israeli-American Council, to Birthright. I think they are the largest Zionist, pro-Israel donors of the Jewish community, and it's great that they're here. I don't want to do this. We are here to talk about anti-Semitism and how to counter anti-Semitism. And I think if we want to do that, we need to understand what is anti-Semitism, who's behind it, and then we can understand how to counter it. So in my opinion, anti-Semitism is coming from three different sources. One of them is the traditional Christian anti-Semitism, what we call radical right, which existed more than 2,000 years, and in the United States, more than 200 years. And this is hatred to the Jews, to the minorities, to the black, to the Mexicans, to anyone that is not white and Christian. And anyone that thinks that President Trump brought this anti-Semitism to America, I think has a mistake. It's existed 2,000 years, and it will exist as long as the world exists. The second type of anti-Semitism coming from radical Islam that existed from the 7th century. They have intolerance to anyone that is an infidel, which is un-Jewish. So they hate the Christians, they hate the Jews, they hate the Hindus, they hate anything that is not Muslim. They have some kind of tolerance toward them. But over the last 130, 140 years, as Jews return to Israel and start settle Israel, their hatred to the Jews have exceeded the imagination. They cannot accept Jewish people living in an area that they think is a Muslim area. So since the time the Jews came to Israel, they put on their goal to destroy the Jewish community in Israel, to kill the Jews in Israel, boycott them, and this trend is still going today. It's part, obviously, of the Islamization of the world, but they have special attention for the Jews, and they put on their goal is to eradicate the state of Israel and not leave any living Jew in Israel. The third kind of anti-Semitism coming from the radical left. It's kind of a phenomena of the last 30 years. I believe that the reason the radical left hate not the Jews, because many of them are Jews. Why they hate the state of Israel? Is because it resembles the America. We are an oasis of democracy here. We represent the same values that America stands for, Judeo-Christian, capitalism, innovation, freedom, and they want to change America. But you don't start with the big target. You start with the small target. It's very easy to pick on the Jews, to pick on Israel. We're a small country, the size of New Jersey, and the Jews, half of the Jews are against us, so we are the weakest, really, community to fight against, but their goals much bigger than Israel. Now, over the last 15 years, a special coalition evolved. It's kind of an unbelievable coalition between the radical Muslims and the radical left. The radical left believe that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. They don't understand, however, that they are sleeping with the enemy. As Islamization take over Europe and the United States, the first people that find themselves in prison, and that's the best case scenario, are the radical left. But for the time being, they feel that together they are building coalition, they're building strengths, and together they can make, each one of them, make the changes they want to do. Later on, we'll see who's standing alive. Now, together they have really are using the language of human right against Israel and against the Jews. Here we go. So this is part of the slogans that the enemies of Israel are using in the United States. They're building coalition with the gay and lesbian. This is over there on the top right. With the African American, Angela Davis here. With the gender equality in the middle, Indians, Americans, and obviously from Ferguson to Palestine, again with the African American and with the minority communities in the United States. And this is here a coalition of organizations that passed BDS resolution in UCLA, comprised of 25 different organizations with different causes, and they're all coming together as a coalition to denounce the state of Israel. Now, what can we do about it? What is the Jewish community doing about it? So the Jewish community for the last, BDS existed for about 15 years. For the first 10 years, everybody was asleep. Jewish community believed if we don't say anti-Semitism, if we don't say BDS, it will disappear. Well, it did not disappear. It's intensified. And now in the last 5 years, the Jewish community have woken up, the state of Israel woken up, and together we are doing mostly asbara. We are communicating the truth about Israel. We're telling them that we are human rights. We are, innovation. We are helping the world. We are in Haiti. We are in Nepal. We are great light to the nation. And the truth is, I don't think that telling the truth about Israel is enough. We need to do some other things. Starting with the fact that we need to basically show that the people who came against Israel and against the Jews are enemies of America. We need to communicate the truth about BDS. Who is behind it? What's their agenda? And maybe through communication, we can start gathering more troops. Let me show you what a Muslim professor saying today in the United States.
There are a large number of Zionists who are engaged with Nazi Germany. Zionism, rather than being defeating anti-Semitism, is actually accepted anti-Semitism as the norm. Some would say that America has the best Congress that money can buy. But we also say that our Congress is an Israeli-occupied territory. We've been watching Intifada in Palestine. We've been watching an uprising in Iraq. And the question is that what are we doing? How come we don't have an Intifada in this country? The only language that the slave master understands is the language of violence.
We are the slave master.
But we need to translate our strength into harassment of the political leadership. We need to harass them. You need to sit in their offices, have a civil disobedience. And it's about time that we have an intifada in this country that changes fundamentally the political dynamics in here.
I'm kind of running out of time. I just want to say that anti-Semitism, BDS, is growing in the United States like never before. They are riding on the progressive movement, what is known mostly as intersectionality. Basically says that all the underprivileged, all the minority groups in the United States needs to unite and fight against each one enemies. As such, the African Americans, the Latinos, the Armenians, anyone that have a grudge with anything, unite together to fight against their oppressors. And as such, we have now all progressive movement in the United States becoming anti-Israel. And people like Linda Sarsour, who is a known anti-Semite, who said that Zionism is creepy and that Saudi Arabia is a bastion of women liberalism, is a leader of the woman progressive movement in the United States. We are really in trouble unless we can show that the enemies of Israel, the enemies of the Jews, are the enemies of America. And maybe in the question and answer I can go more into it. I don't want to take more time. This is just an image that we drew 2 years ago. And you can see today how true it is that Israel is the floodgate. If we allow the radical Islam to take over Israel and the Jews, and it's becoming easier because you can see the radical left holding our hands hostage and don't let us even fight back. If we let this happen, this flood is already flooding Europe, where terrorists are dancing with multiculturalism with the Europeans and blowing things all over. If we let this happen, very soon it will come to America. And this image is 2 years ago. The only big crime we had 2 years ago, it was San Bernardino. Today we have many more, including Orlando. So we need to understand that whatever starts with the Jews, never end with the Jews. We need to show that our enemies are the enemies of the world. And I'll show later on the question and answer how we're doing that. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. At this point, I'll start offering questions. If you have some questions there, just for me, just raise your hand so I'll know that you have them. So the first question is, all right, so there is anti-Semitism, etc., but, I mean, I heard yesterday the Chief of Staff of the Army and General Eisenkot, and he didn't mention a word that this is a danger to the State of Israel. So what is the danger to the State of Israel? Sima, you want to start?
First of all, it's not a surprise that General Eisenkot didn't mention anti-Semitism. It's not his authority to work with anti-Semitism. So he is talking about Hezbollah and Syria and Iraq and Iran and so on. So I think everybody agrees that anti-Semitism as a form of an opinion, if it was, you know, just in one place and wasn't affecting relationship between countries and the connection between Israel as a state of the Jewish people with the Jewry outside of Israel, we might have think about it as a phenomena that exists, will always exist, just as Adam said, and needed not to be addressed. But I think that when it comes to political outcomes to this kind of phenomena, when our rival is becoming more and more numerous, when we are outnumbered, when they are fused with ideology of hatred, when they are fused with enormous amount of money, you don't understand how much money is poured into the other side. We cannot and we shouldn't look at anti-Semitism as something that happens in France, and at the worst case, they should come to Israel. Jews should be all over the world because this is a global world. We should have Jewry outside of Israel. I think it's important for connections and for everything. And it's happening. It's not something that we can control. But the fact that some of us don't want to see the truth, I think this is the most scary thing. I'm talking to a lot of audiences, and I can see that they don't want to recognize the threat that we are facing. And this is the first step, understanding that the challenge today is not tanks on the border, and it's not rockets launched against Israel, although it also exists, but it's something else. It is something that is appealing to the young generation, and it's very hard to fight against. And they are masking their true goals with a language of liberalism and social rights and freedom of speech and freedom of academy. But if you look at the way they are handling themselves, none of these liberal values are engaged in their action. So it's amazing that some of the people are failing to see the truth.
Anybody want? Please, whoever wants to take on. Adam first.
I think that Israel has two guardian angels. One is the IDF, and Gadi Eisenkot is right. The other one is the United States of America. It's the only superpower ally of Israel. And what is happening right now in the United States is erosion of the support for Israel. The Muslims and the radical left are gathering political power, gathering momentum, and the support for Israel is eroding. For example, just last month in California, the Democratic Party of California, 3,000 representatives, many of them Jews, passed a resolution in California, in Sacramento, basically condemning the American administration who's giving U.S. aid to the country named Israel, who is occupying illegally territories, oppressing the Palestinians. This is a Democratic Party, and we know that if Hillary wasn't elected to be the leader of the Democratic Party, the people that were sitting on the platform committee like Cornel West and Zagat were anti-Israel clearly, and they were trying to pass anti-Israel resolution. So if we're not on guard, we might lose the biggest supporter Israel is, and Israel cannot survive without it, which is the United States of America.
Mr. Bardají,
just relate a little anecdote about the importance of fighting the anti-Semitism, though it's not clearly related. In 2002, at the end of the year, all the planning on the Iraqi military intervention was going on, the Spanish Prime Minister went to Paris to meet with President Chirac at the time, President of France, in order to avoid the split among the Europeans and supporting the campaign of ousting Saddam Hussein. And at the end of the meeting, when it was clear that we couldn't agree on anything, and Chirac was very, very anti-American, he said to us, well, what would you do if you had 6 million Muslims in your country? Well, 15 years later, the last election of Macron, when you start analyzing the circumscriptions and you start to see how many Muslims had allowed him to win in many of those circumscriptions, what could be the impact on their foreign policy vis-à-vis Israel and the Middle East in the future if he has his hand tied up because of his voters? That's a risk we cannot forget, which is very tangible.
I'd like to make two quick points. Adam spoke earlier about Ferguson to Palestine or Ferguson to Gaza. At ISGAP, we did research on how the Nation of Islam in the United States, the Farrakhan's group, actually funded the whole notion of Ferguson to Gaza. And the Students for Justice in Palestine and the Nation of Islam are working together and demonizing when the ADL brings police officers from the United States to Israel to be trained in counterterrorism. The people in the African American community are saying that the Israelis are training American police officers to kill young African American men. So this is the discourse in the African American community. And I think the second issue in terms of the United States that we have to look at, and I'm not a strategic expert and I don't understand these global strategic issues very well, but I know in terms of anti-Semitism, Emmanuel Levinas, a great Jewish philosopher, said that we become human the instant we see the other. As soon as we see our face and the face of the other, this is the instant we become human. So all civil societies have to recognize the other. The Iranian revolutionary regime, radical Islam, does not recognize the other as human. In fact, Jews are perceived as urine and excrement from donkeys and the like. So what are the implications ideologically and politically when the United States of America under the Obama administration does a deal with Iran where there's $150 billion being transferred to the regime that is dedicated to the extermination of not only the State of Israel but Jewish people around the world? What happens when Siemens and Boeing does business with the Iranian revolutionary regime? And what happens now under the current administration when hundreds of billions of dollars of serious weapons are being traded to Saudi Arabia that from my simple perspective of studying anti-Semitism also perceives the Jews as a serious problem at the core of their ideology. And it goes deep, at least a century, into this Islamic culture. How does this discourse affect the United States of America? How does this discourse affect education in the United States of America? How does this affect international relations? And these are serious questions that I think people who know these issues better than we do, and those of us who study anti-Semitism, really need to take a structural, deep understanding of, because from my perspective, the legitimization of this discourse is damaging, and it's starting to enter into the society in a very dangerous way, I feel.
One, we mentioned that, I think Adam mentioned, we cannot lose the United States. I think we already had a couple of incidents, slight hints in the last few years. I mean, not recently, President Obama not vetoing decision in the UN, and during the war in Gaza, that for 2 days flights were stopped to Israel. This has never happened before, or at least to my recollection, and I think, or at least in recent history, I'm not talking about the Eisenhower days. So we can certainly, we're in the danger that at some point there'll be a UN resolution, and perhaps, probably maybe not this president, but the next president could end up not vetoing. And then the question is, in anti-Semitic Europe, will they be very happy to sanction Israel and not allow any money transfer here? That's a real danger, more, I believe, than any rocket. But the question I have, this creates an interesting dilemma. On the one hand, we feel that the Democratic Party is losing Israel, or Israel is losing the Democratic Party in the United States, but we cannot afford that as Israel, because there will be a Democratic president again in the United States. I don't know when, I don't have the horoscope yet, or my horoscope is not always right. But I think that in general, this is going to happen. There was a question that came about from the audience also, that I'll start there for Mr. Bardají. Says, okay, well, we have to keep both the right and the left within our camp. So wouldn't the price that Israel will pay in the liberal Jewish community be too high, in North America will be too high, if we align ourselves with some of the extreme right in Europe? And that's a question of a trade-off in what we need. So I'll let you first start, and anybody who wants to add to that.
You know,
No, Mr. Bardají first. Adam.
Me?
No, Mr. Bardají first. Because he raised the issue, so I'll start with him.
Very brief. I mean, this wall is not perfect, and the players are what they are. And in Europe, if you go with the left, you are as suicidal as we are. So I don't think it's a good option. What implication could have for the democratic support of Israel? I'm not an expert in America. I'm not an American. I wouldn't dare to make any recommendation. But it seems to me from far away that the Democratic Party has been moving towards a more extreme positions in all kinds of aspects, including the Middle East and including Israel. But the bipartisanship consensus that has moved all the Jewish communities and groups in the United States probably have to be rethinking, in the sense that if you want to get everyone on board at this particular juncture of history, which I think in Europe at least we are in a very, very, very fragile and delicate situation, you get nothing done if you're looking for bipartisanship. It's different in America, but in Europe, if you try to get the left and the right together, it's such a minimum common position, if there's any, that you end up surrendering yourself. And that you have to make some choice at some time. On the long run, yes, I agree, you need to get everyone on board. But now, for the short term, I think in Europe, the only players that may alleviate the situation is this alternative right. And you have to sell your product differently in the United States. It's the only thing that I can say, you know.
Adam?
Yossie, I think as Jews we can sit here for years and discuss anti-Semitism, but I think we need to think outside of the box how to counter it. And we finally have an independent Jewish state, the State of Israel. We were born here. We know how to fight back. We need to take this courage all over the world, and we need to fight back. We need to move to offense. Enough is enough. And I think we need to make anti-Semitism, we need to show that anti-Semitism is an American problem, is a European problem. I think in my video I started showing it, that the people that started being anti-Semites, they're anti-Americans. Our enemies are the enemies of America. They want to change the way of life in America. We need to use our strengths to study them, to research them, to show who they are, who's funding it, what's the agenda. We need to fight back. I think our organization, the Israeli American Council, not only passing anti-BDS bills in the United States, in different states, but we also making sure by deep research that those states are actually implementing anti-BDS resolutions. When the campaign to end the Israeli occupation made a conference a few months ago in D.C. and wanted to visit the offices of different congressmen and senators, we advised those lawmakers that the people who want to come talk to them, which is a legal right, are actually coming to talk about Israel, and most of those meetings got canceled. We need to fight back. We need to move from defense to offense, put them on the office and show that we're dealing with an American problem. Anti-Semitism is an American problem, and then we have millions with us. Right now, half of the Jews are against us. The rest don't know. Everybody is confused. We need to make it an American problem.
And Charles, you wanted to add something?
So I would like to try to sort of flip the situation in a sense.
Lift it up.
Elie Wiesel and Robert Wistrich always used to speak about how anti-Semitism begins with Jews, but it never ends with Jews. And I think what's happening in Europe may not be so much an Israeli or Jewish problem. Anti-Semitism is a diversion, and it's a strategic threat to Europe. And we see that the center in Europe is splitting, and Europe has serious social problems of anti-Semitism. And I think the longer Western intellectuals, European leaders, and North American leaders ignore anti-Semitism, their own security becomes at risk. So it's a European, as Adam said, an American problem as well. Not so much a Jewish problem at some level.
One of the narratives, so if you read Israeli newspapers, except maybe one, there's a few narratives here that are repeating. One, anti-Semitism is rising because of Trump. I think that's a little bit strange, given the fact that the numbers have been rising for years and has nothing to do with it. And we know that most of them are not coming statistically from the right. I could worry less about a swastika here and there painted by some skinheads in Long Beach. We've had them for God knows what. We can live with that. They are outside of the American society or the consensus. I think what's the bigger question that actually has been asked a lot in Israeli society, and I think it's important maybe for us people here to give the view the way we see it, is how much Israeli government actions affect anti-Semitism and anti-Israel, at least in where we live, whether it's Europe or the United States. So, and we also have some information on that. So I don't know who wants to start with this challenge. Hey, I didn't say it would be easy.
No, I think Yossie, you're right. I think the people in Israel believe. I mean, I grew up here, and we were singing songs that sang the whole world is always against us. Whatever we do, let's not, forget about the UN, forget about the world, because they're always against us. And so the issues of anti-Semitism, as they grow in Europe and in the United States, are not seen here as a big threats to Israel, because we always relied on our own. But I think it's a mistake to believe that the anti-Semitism, the growing anti-Semitism, the growing BDS in the world, the anti-Israel campaigns in the world have no strategic challenge to Israel. In fact, they have existential threat to the state of Israel. And I think the state of Israel has been woken up in the last few years. Sima said it. The state of Israel is paying attention. The state of Israel is putting a lot of efforts into understanding who's against us and what are the best methods to defeat it. And I hope that the media here in Israel will pay attention to the fact that this is an existential threat, because the enemies of Israel have moved to war by other means. If until in 1973 they believed they can defeat Israel with military, they came to the conclusion it's not working, and they are working now to defeat Israel, to eradicate the state of Israel by other means, by boycotts, by international pressure, by completely separation of economic relationship. The same way was down to South Africa. And I think the people in Israel should wake up and should help our brothers and sisters in the United States and all over the world. I think the Israeli-American community in Israel, in the United States, is a strategic asset for the state of Israel and the people of Israel. And we want to fight with them. We need to wake up. We need to put a lot of efforts into it. We need to unite, and we need to fight united against anti-Semitism.
Anybody wants to add to the political mess, or you're?
I don't want to enter the political mess, but I have to say one thing. First of all, statistically speaking, there is a connection between what is happening here in Israel and what happens outside of Israel. We cannot ignore that. But we have to understand two things. First of all, in most cases, it doesn't matter what happened really here in Israel. It is portrayed in such a way outside of Israel. Take the Marmara case, for example, in such a way that when you have no other information other than what the BBC puts in front of you, it's obvious that you would be against this country who does horrible things. So first of all, in many cases, it's just an excuse for an ongoing phenomena, and it's peaks. You have a protective edge, you have a peak. You have a pillar of cloud, you have a peak. You have the Marmara issue. I was the chief censor of Israel in the Marmara case. I remember how much we planned before just to make sure that we will not harm anybody on this ship, and then see how it was published abroad. So we are facing two things. First of all, that's an excuse what happens here. Second thing is Israel is meeting double standard all the time. I just want to remind you that we are facing 4 Ds: delegitimization, dehumanization, and one of the 4 Ds is actually double standard. People treat us differently, especially in the national organization and the international organization. And you should remember that, because sometimes I think that people are being affected of what is being said about us on the outside, and sometimes one of the papers here in Israel also.
Anybody wants to add?
Well, I would like to make the point that whatever you do or you don't do here is less and less relevant outside Israel. Because in Europe, at least, is an informal coalition from the left and the Muslim communities, and they don't pay attention. They just inject whatever they want into the media, into the debate, independently of what action has been taken here or policy or not. They always demonize Israel for whatever reason. They find the ideological framework and settings, and they don't need any action. What is nonetheless important to say is that some actions here make more difficult for the friends of Israel in Europe to defend Israel from time to time. But that happens with every government. And so, in terms of anti-Semitism, I think it's progressively irrelevant what you do or you don't do.
Charles, do you want to add anything?
Sure. I think I agree with all the statements that were made. I'll just add that I think as time goes on, it's going to become more and more clear, unfortunately, for Europe and other parts of the world, that Israel is really at the front line. It's the front line of the attack, not only of anti-Semitism, but the attack against democratic principles and basic notions of citizenship and equality under one legal system. And I think the sooner people stop blaming Israel and the Jews for these issues and looking at the victim and understand what's at stake, it'll be the better, not just for the Israelis and the Jews, it'll be better for people fighting for democratic principles in Europe, North America, and certainly in the Middle East, where there's allies here that need support and help that we've written off.
1 minute, each one, last statement.
Let's stay united against the real threat, not a supposed to be threat, and let's face the truth.
Let's wake up. Let's show the world that we are the floodgate and that our enemies are the enemies of Europe and America, and then we will have millions of people beside us, because today we have very few against about 2 billion people in the world.
As I can't see the Western world without Israel, I think the Israelis should pay also attention to what's happening in Europe, because it's very difficult to see a future of Israel without the traditional allies, Europe or America. So we are fighting the same enemies. Anti-Semitism in Europe is primarily focused on the Jewish communities, but it's an expression of a much more deeper and broader movement against the Western values.
Just say I want to concur, and I also want to thank Yossie very much for putting this important panel together.
I want to say one more thing with your permission, Yossi. I've heard a lot of people telling us to give up Europe, and I want to say we cannot afford ourselves to lose Europe. We have to fight not just to stay friends with the United States. Europe is too important for us to lose it.
We did not mention, by the way, that there's another third of the world that is the fastest growing one, and I think we might want to pay attention a little bit. So we have not lost there. I think we're still on the upper hand when it comes to India and China. But this is something area that I think we should spend some money and time, because we are there. I think we're still on the winning side, not on the losing side. At this point, I'd always like to finish a minute before, so unlike others. So I want to thank everybody for participating and for the work that you're doing, and thank you all for coming today. Thank you.